Welcome to the Express Boats State of Waterfowl podcast series, presented by Gros Savon Lodge. Join our host, Doug Miller, Executive Operations Manager at Gros Savon Lodge, wildlife biologist and passionate waterfowler, along with co-hosts, world champion duck caller Jim Ronquest and conservationist Kason Shore. State of Waterfowl is designed to provide you, our audience, with data, valuable insight, and information gathered from our guests that will allow us to scientifically determine the state of waterfowl, the health of our resource. We understand that the most valuable asset that we have is our resource, and that is waterfowl. Without them, we do not have a season, commerce, purpose. Join us today as we dig deeper into what is the state of waterfowl.
All right, welcome to another edition of State of Waterfowl series. Going to be another great episode today. We got the whole gang here again. Jim Ronquest, we got you holding down the fort up in Stuttgart. I see you there. And Kason, we got you in the house tonight. Kason, you getting ready to do any rice farming up there? Have y'all started cutting anything yet?
We're not cutting anything yet, but we're getting close to draining some rice. I may haul some last bit of diesel fuel tomorrow, so we're nearing the end. Yeah,
we got a sample today, so we're ready to go. We're gonna find combines up at it. Never stop raining over here.
So, well, there's some getting drained in Stuttgart area, but the rain y'all are getting, I don't know how you're dealing with it.
Yeah, it's a mess. So, speaking of rain, one of the things that we're not getting in some of the places we get is rain, and that's a big subject tonight. We got a really cool guest with us. We got Dr. Mike Brasher with Ducks Unlimited. He is the co-host of the EU podcast and a waterfowl scientist with Ducks Unlimited, and we're going to visit with him today and talk about a lot of the issues going on in the state of waterfowl. Mike, glad you could be with us.
Thank you, Doug. It's a pleasure to be here and be with all of you. I know most every face here and I've had plenty of conversations with you, so I look forward to another one.
Well, I think we just need to jump into this. We always end up running short on time when we're talking about ducks, and I think the biggest thing in everybody's mind right now is what's going on in the prairie region of the North Dakota, South Dakota, Canada area, and what's happening, what conditions look like up there.
I will tell you what I know, and what I know comes from a series of conversations with our biologists, Ducks Unlimited Canada, some of our biologists with DU Inc. here in the States, also some conversations with Canadian Wildlife Service biologists over the summer, and North Dakota Game and Fish. Actually, I spoke with someone from Dakota as well recently. So, although I haven't been physically to the prairies, either in the U.S. or Canada this year, I have talked to a lot of people that are there, and so I have a pretty good feel of what's happening. And of course, as you mentioned, the universal word is that it's dry. Wetlands are quite dry this year across the entire U.S. and Canadian prairies. I think most of them are describing this as one of the most severe and widespread drought that we've seen across the U.S. and Canadian prairies since the late 80s. Now, to kind of put some, kind of that up a little bit, what I will say is that there are certain areas that are worse than others. That's not going to be a surprise. North Dakota and southwestern Manitoba are probably some of the driest areas. And we've seen some data out of North Dakota here earlier this summer that showed an 80% drop in the number of ponds that they count on their survey from last year to this year. That's like they've never before seen a drop that dramatic from year over year in terms of pond numbers. Now, duck numbers were not down by that same degree. I think maybe only down 30% in terms of the ducks that they counted in North Dakota. That's the only state in our province in the prairies from which we have data this year. Of course, there's another year of cancellation of the breeding population survey in that part of North America. But there are ports of spots of good water, not like excellent conditions or anything of that nature, but there are spots of localized areas where Wetland conditions have been decent and have kind of held on throughout the summer and are producing ducks. So it's not a total bust. Areas of eastern South Dakota, based on what I heard from Rocco Murano, the state waterfowl biologist there in South Dakota, they're producing some ducks in eastern South Dakota. There are even a few spots in North Dakota where they've received some rain here over the summer, and improved conditions a little bit. The entire prairie region came into the spring breeding season dry. And that actually began last year for some portions of the prairies. But yeah, what a contrast it has been to last year, at least the U.S. side of the border, because North Dakota and South Dakota were just like busting at the seams in terms of wetland conditions, and then it just dried up, turned off. A little bit of rain in some of the western Canadian provinces earlier this summer, I guess in June it might have been, based on some reports from Pat Kehoe, that improved conditions a little bit in western Saskatchewan, a little bit in Alberta, but none of that is going to save duck production in prairies this year. It's dry, it's widespread dry, and we going to have a lot of ducks that will overfly the prairies. Some of those ducks that overfly may not breed at all. Some may try to breed once they get to the boreal forest, or some of them may even head on north into Alaska. But the production of those birds that are overflying the prairies, we don't think is going to be very good. So I guess to kind of summarize here, and then we can delve into any details if you want to. But out of the prairies, we expect very low duck production this year. And that's going to mean a less than stellar fall flight, especially in the central and Mississippi flyway. And that's the one thing that we try to remind folks when we talk about where the impacts of this drought are going to be felt most severely. It's going to be in those two central flyways. Most of the birds in the Pacific flyway come from some of the more western provinces, the western boreal forest, Alaska. The prairie region of the U.S. and Canada does give some birds to the Pacific flyway and some to the Atlantic flyway. I'll make no mistake about that. But it's the Mississippi Central flyway that's going to be feeling sort of the pinch of this most severely. I'll stop there. There's a lot more we can say, and I would like to talk about the drought, kind of short term, long term. Drought's not necessarily a universally bad thing, so I want to make sure we cover that. But I'll pause right there, Doug, and we can whatever direction you want.
That's actually one of the questions I was thinking about asking, because we play this doom and gloom, but if people follow nature and wildlife management, everything's cyclic. One thing leads to another, and even though in the short term we're having a very bad drought that's causing these issues, long term could be some good things for the prairie. And you talked about it, hadn't seen this since the 80s. Following the 80s, though, we had a great rebound. Duck population spiked because, and correct me if I'm wrong, but gives these ponds a chance to kind of heal over, revegetate, and get things back prime condition. Is that correct? Elaborate a little bit on that.
Yeah, you're exactly right, Doug. And this kind of requires a little bit of, it brings to bear some of our understanding of wetland ecology. What happens is these wetlands stay wet for too long is all of that vegetation, all of that organic material that gets kind of bound up in the soil, it becomes locked up because it's not exposed to air, and there's just not a whole lot of decomposition of that vegetation, which is really where some of our nutrients are bound up. There's not a lot of decomposition that occurs under anaerobic flooded conditions. There's a little bit, but not a whole lot. And it's not until those soils, that organic matter dries out and gets exposed to oxygen, that decomposition, that recycling of nutrients really takes off. And nutrients are the base of all food chains. The productivity of wetlands all across the globe varies based on the amount of nutrients that are available to feed those systems. And when those nutrients which get taken up by plants, get taken up by animals. As those things die, they kind of sink to the bottom of the wetlands. And as long as they're flooded, you have anaerobic conditions, not a recycling of nutrients that occurs as a general rule in situations. And it requires that periodic drying to expose those organic materials to oxygen and really accelerate that decomposition, that recycling of the nutrients. It allows that vegetation to regrow, because there's, we all know that there's water gets too deep and stagnant for too long. There's only so many types of plants that can grow in those conditions, and a lot of them aren't too valuable from a duck production standpoint. So it resets the entire thing, quite frankly. It recycles some of those nutrients that have been bound up in organic material, and it also allows revegetation of those wetland substrates. And then what happens is once those wetlands once they refill, then it leads to an explosion of that food chain again. Those invertebrates come alive. They hatch from their eggs and their I forget exactly what they're called, but they reemerge and they rehatch and repopulate those wetlands and provide stimulus for that food chain to take off again. And so, one of the things that we try to do in Ducks Unlimited is we talk about drought. We try not to couch it as bad because it's necessary. We try to talk about wetlands being dry. The physical condition, when we go drought, those wetlands dry up. It's not necessarily a bad thing unless it stays dry for way too long. There's a lot of other things that can happen, but drought is a necessary inconvenience to rejuvenate the productivity of those prairie wetlands, and then we've seen it time and again. Those ducks will respond to the increased productivity once those dried ones refill with water.
Mike, along with that, can you explain how when duck populations go down, predator populations go down, and then the first couple of years coming back with really good habitat quality, predator populations haven't caught up with duck production, so we have even a kind of a extra boost of potential recruitment there because of the lack of predators?
Yeah, it's a good point, Jim. And you saying that reminds me that I forgot to mention one part of that kind of food chain deal. As wetlands stay inundated, stay wet for too long, I talked about the productivity of those declining because some of those nutrients are bound up. Well, the net result of that is you also see a decline or a shift in the invertebrate communities in those wetlands. And so they're not as productive from a food production standpoint for ducklings or for hens to accumulate the resources that they need in order to produce the eggs, and then the ducklings to grow rapidly and become feathered and attain weight and all that. So it all relates to this idea of a food chain. And when foods become constrained for one reason or another, then the individuals, the groups of animals that prey on those food resources, predators, and ducks are predators as well. They're just predators of these little aquatic invertebrates. And the predators you're talking about are going to be some of the mammalian predators, and it may be even some of the avian predators that we know put some pressures on breeding duck populations. And so they go through the same type of thing. And the drying of prairie wetlands brings that to a pretty acute situation where, as those wetlands dry, it doesn't immediately kill all the ducks that once bred in the prairies. But what happens is if there's no water there, no wetlands, a lot of those ducks are going to overfly. So you see a pretty dramatic decline in duck populations in that prairie landscape. A lot of those birds have just overflown to other areas. So if you think about mammalian predators being the critters that eat the ducks, the nesting ducks, and then they also eat the ducklings, if there aren't as many there, then their opportunity, their food source is going to be a bit constrained. And so those mammalian predators are going to kind of go through that same type of pinch that ducklings or hen ducks do once their food resources decline. So what you were saying, Jim, about why then? So that's kind of why predators are going to are going to suffer as well during this period. Their populations will go down a little bit because they're not able to acquire the duck and ducklings that they need to feed and produce and grow babies. But then what happens is that once those wetlands refill, those ducks that had previously overflown will come back in and resettle in the landscapes, those that are still with us, and they will quickly repopulate, and the predator population will be depressed and will not be putting as much pressure on the hens and the ducklings. And that kind of predator-prey relationship is occurring at a massive landscape scale. So the effect of that drying of prairie wetlands, its effects on the ducks and ducklings, and then the cascading to the predator population, it occurs across that entire landscape. So that's my best attempt at sort of a predator-prey 101.
Mike, let me ask you this. Is there an uptick in, say, overhead cover or habitat in general in terms of plant reproduction or growth after it comes out of a drought period? I know you see that with more soil units, disturbed soil there. So is there a little more nesting cover and vertical cover as well?
Well, there certainly will be in the areas around wetlands, in the wetlands as well as around the wetland perimeters. Now, I don't know that we'd see a big pulse of vegetation in any of the up areas. That's going to kind of be totally dependent upon just the precipitation that they would receive. But yeah, certainly once we get into the wetland basins. Matter of fact, I was talking to Dr. Mike Anderson here recently, and he was describing his recent trip to Minnesota, southwest Manitoba, and he was saying a lot of these wetlands are dry. Even certainly all the temporary and seasonal wetlands in the landscape are dry. There's still a fair bit of water in some of the permanent wetlands as well as semi-permanent wetlands, and those semi-permanent wetlands, that water has kind of receded away from the cattail that typically and other robust emergent vegetation that lines those wetlands. And so you still have a wet substrate because there's still water in some of those wetlands. And what is happening is that cattail is growing. So yeah, I think the short answer is, Kason, that we will see an increase in the productivity even among those vegetation communities, and that's part of the entire cycle of the rejuvenation of that productivity, because it's really that vegetation that is the base of those food chains, those detrital food chains that the invertebrates feed on, and so yeah, absolutely, that's part of the rejuvenation process.
So, Mike, under normal conditions, we say pressure from hunting is somewhat insignificant to the overall population of ducks, but that's under normal conditions. When we get into a drought situation, and you talked about some really low production, if any, in some areas, how does hunting still play a role in that? Should we be paying attention to harvest rates of hunters this year? Or I guess my concern is, we react to numbers a year in the past and not actually as things occur. What's your thoughts on harvest numbers coming up this year versus making an impact on ducks that could last long term?
Yeah, that's a great question, Doug. And we here at Ducks Unlimited have fielded a number of questions from our members and our supporters who have also expressed concern or question about whether we should be concerned about going into this fall and winter with a liberal season amidst what we're describing as one of the most severe droughts since the late 80s. And there's a number of things here. And one thing I'll say is that the information that I can provide, the understanding of this situation that I can share, comes from my interactions with our partners at the state and federal level, Fish and Wildlife Service, Canadian Wildlife Service, and then all of our state waterfowl biologists who actually have seats at the table for making these harvest management decisions. It's only since I started serving as a co-host of the Ducks Unlimited podcast that I've started to learn about the harvest regulations at a fairly deep level, because I'm kind of trained as a habitat manager, not really a harvest manager. So I have to provide that kind of caveat, is that I'm not the one at the table, but we have great colleagues and great partners that have done a pretty good job trying to educate me on this. So here's what I can share based on what we've learned. There's a couple of things to keep in mind to set the stage for this discussion. One of which is that although we are looking at a really severe drought, we came in and so the other thing that complicates this, of course, is the fact that we don't have breeding population estimates for the last 2 years, right? That's what it's like we have this confluence of unprecedented circumstances, and we hope we never deal with them again. But if you go back to 2019 and look at the breeding population numbers, we were still in really good shape with the breeding population estimates. And I'm going to dig here for a number because I want to make sure we kind of get this. If we look at 2019, that's the last year when we actually had breeding population data from the traditional survey areas, what I'm going to be referencing, and that's basically the Great Lakes states, Prairie US, Prairie Canada, Western Boreal Forest, and up into Alaska. We had 39 million breeding ducks in the spring of 2019. That's a really big number. If you look back to the period of reference where we talk about the drought of the late 80s, we were talking about from 1985 through 1992, let me go 1991, we didn't have a breeding population estimate above 29 million. It was 25 million in 85 and 25 million for a couple of years in the late 80s. But in 2019, we had 39 million breeding ducks estimated in that traditional survey area. So if I were to do my math, that's almost 50% greater in 2019 than what we had during any of those years of the drought of the late 80s. So that's the one thing we got to remember is that going into 2019, we were still reaping the gains of a long string of wet conditions and good habitat conditions across the prairies. Now, last year, we didn't have a survey, obviously, so we have a little bit of a blind spot there on what the population numbers were last year, but the bottom will not have fallen out in 1 year. The bottom will not have fallen out even in 2 years. And if we remember last year, the Dakotas were exceptionally wet, produced a lot of ducks, and in Canada kind of probably did okay. So last year, on balance, was probably average, maybe slightly below average, but it wasn't a bad year. So if you think about kind of carryover to this year, let me think about this. What I believe I can say, if I'm remembering this correctly, they did some projections for the breeding population size last year. And I think the number, no, they only did it for mallards. That's right. That's why I was struggling to come up with a number. For mallards, the breeding population estimate that they projected last year was, bear with me here, was like 9.2 million. And that's still pretty darn good. If you look at our mallard numbers in the late 80s, we were at 5 million, 6 million, 5.5 million. So 5.5 million versus 9 million, we're not in a position of low population abundances as we came into 2019 or even as was projected last year. This year, I don't know what the number is going to be, but it's not going to have dropped 4 or 5 million. So the population status is good right now. And the drought that we're seeing right now is not going to fundamentally change that. Now, if we want to start talking about multiple years of drought, then we can kind of start talking about some fairly significant declines over the next few years. To your question here, Doug, in terms of what it means for harvest, the first thing I would say, we still have strong population abundances right now. The boreal forest is in excellent condition. It's going to produce its normal crop of ducks, maybe even a little more than what it normally does, certainly for those species closely tied to it. We're going to have species like blue wings, gadwalls, shovelers, mallards, and pintails that are going to struggle in terms of production this year. There's no doubt about that. What it's going to mean for a fall flight is one that's going to be lower than normal and one that's going to be dominated by adult birds. We feel pretty confident in that. So what that's going to mean for hunters, of course, is that it's going to be tougher sledding than normal. And so in terms of harvest rates for this year or what we would be looking at, I don't think any of our harvest managers are concerned. given the health of the population, that we're gonna do any kind of irreparable harm to duck populations. There's also a bit of, we think, self-regulation in harvest. The more adult birds you have in the population, the harder they are to decoy, the harder they are to get close enough to kill. So it wouldn't surprise me if there was a decline in harvest rates this year. I don't know that, but that's something that we'll be able to look at. But this harvest management system that's in place is continues to be the best system that we have for making these annual decisions. Certainly is. It makes us nervous going into a liberal season with a drought and not having data from either the past 2 years. But harvest has save a few species. You can over harvest any critter on the planet if you try hard enough. But our system of harvest management that we've had in place for all these decades has held us at harvest rates that are pretty low. Adult male mallards, you're looking at a harvest rate somewhere around 10 or 11%, and it's really, really hard for us to get that harvest rate above that. That's just a really small percentage of overall mortality that occurs during any given year. So, no, I don't think there are any of our waterfowl harvest managers that are concerned about 1 year of liberal harvest during a drought year. And matter of fact, I know some of them are talking about this being a really valuable learning opportunity, and because it feels like it's like if we were to rewind the clock about 10 years when they were setting regulations during the year in which data were collected. Feels like this might be a year where they were ratcheting back. We don't know that, but it feels like it. But this is a year in which now we have a liberal season, and we can get a data point, get some data that will really help us understand what is the effect of that harvest on a population. So no one is concerned about it driving populations down to alarmingly low levels, and we know duck populations are incredibly resilient, and as long as you have the habitat in place, they're going to be fine.
Very cool. Talking about, this is maybe getting the wrong direction there, but along with population estimates, most people are familiar with the BPOT, the yearly deal. One that's not talked about as much that some people don't understand is the Lincoln Harris estimate. I think
Lincoln Peterson. Yeah.
Yeah, my bad. I don't know where Harrison come from there. Wham! I knew better than that. That being said, could you explain how that works and the differences there?
Well, you're kind of putting me on the spot here, Jim. What?
Man, you're the certified smart person in the room. What are you talking about?
Let me. Well, I have to first say that I don't deal with that Lincoln Peterson estimator very often. You're going to have to make me think about it. It's an estimate. It's a method by which you can estimate population size from harvest. Let me say that. So the big difference here is that the breeding population surveys that we talk about, may BPOP surveys, waterfowl breeding population and habitat survey, they're all conducted in the spring on the breeding grounds. Typically, they're aerial surveys, helicopter or fixed-wing aircraft, and they're physically counting ducks and using different survey criteria to infer the presence of nesting hens that go unobserved during the actual survey. The Lincoln Peterson estimate is actually been around for quite some time, and it's a fairly simple mathematical equation. And if I might have to sketch something out here, but think of it this way. If you know what the harvest rate is, if you know what percentage of a population you harvest, that's your harvest rate, right? And then if you know harvest, then that's a simple calculation to go from harvest to combine harvest rate and harvest to kind of get at what the population size would be. It's like simple, maybe it's not mathematics, maybe it's algebra, but you estimate a population size based on a harvest rate, which comes from banding data, and then we estimate harvest from our harvest surveys. So we have these independent pieces of data, and then when you you combine them, you can derive an estimate of the overall breeding population size. I would have to pause for about a minute and sketch out the equation to actually draw you a mental picture, but let me stop there and see if is that enough, or do we need to go farther?
I think that kind of gets it. We'll revisit that sometime down the road at another get together and really eventually put it out there where it's very understandable. I kind of get it, kind of was a little bit, but I think a lot of folks hear about it, but it's like, what is this? So
yeah, think of it this way. And actually, what we could do there, Jimbo, if you want to do this again, we can like get a little whiteboard and start sketching out and doing some stuff, doing some algebra. You do that, but think of it this way: if we had harvest rate, and then we had population size, it's simple multiplication of harvest rate times population size to figure out what your number of birds harvested is going to be, right? So in this particular situation, we still have two of those numbers. We just have to do the algebra to figure out the third. But in this case, the two that we have are harvest rate and harvest. So I think what we do is we divide harvest by harvest rate, and that will get you an estimate of the population size. I think I'm doing that right in my head here on the fly. So, yeah, that's what it is. It's an estimate that's obtained from the combination of banding data, harvest rate, as well as our harvest surveys, and it's becoming increasingly. It's gaining some additional attention, it's resurfaced in recent years. Dr. Ray Anastaskis at the University of Saskatchewan with Environment and Climate Change Canada has used it to estimate population size of snow geese, and then he's also applied it to mallards. I don't know if it's been applied to pintails or not, because some of the things that you really need in order to get a good estimate, a precise estimate, is you need good harvest. Well, you need both good harvest estimates and good harvest rate estimates. Harvest rate estimates, the precision of those increases as the number of bands and number of band recoveries increases. So here's another plug for hunters if you want to understand how their reporting of band influences these populations, influences our waterfowl management. The more we can crank up that reporting rate, the more precise we can get with our harvest rates, our survival estimates, and everything that we calculate from those. So this Lincoln Peterson estimator that you're talking about is one of those things that we use that band recovery, band reporting data for. And the other thing it allows you to do, Jim, is if you have separate estimates of harvest rate for different age and sex cohorts, and if you have different harvest estimates by age and sex cohort, you can estimate population size of those different age and sex cohorts. So
you can also pull some recruitment numbers out of that, can't you, when you start age classing?
You can pull some, you can get age ratio recruitment data from the parts collection. And I'd have to think about whether what you just said there would be independent of that or not. But the age ratio and recruitment data primarily or most directly comes from the wings that we ask hunters to send in. Those are those are submitted to annual wing bees, and then biologists sit around a table and look at wings and identify them to species, sex, and age. And then that tells us the age ratio in the harvest. And then there's some corrections that could be made there based on vulnerability of adults and juveniles and that kind of stuff. But nevertheless, just as a gross index or just looking at the raw numbers, if you assume that vulnerability is constant across years, you can nevertheless look at some trends in those age ratios and production. So this is a year when we would expect for those prairie nesting species, blue wings, gadwall, shovelers, mallards, pintails, that group, we'd expect their recruitment estimates, those age ratio estimates, to be pretty doggone low.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So kind of moving along here, thinking down the road, thinking the future. And this is probably more a Flyway Council question than yourself, but do you see an idea coming to where we've had, say, a couple bad years of production with the mallards, but we've had good productions, just for example, say with blue wings and gadwalls. I'm just throwing species out there. Do you see them making a change with the harvest going, okay, this year we're going to drop mallards from 4 to 2, but we're going to increase. Well, how do you increase blue wings or gadwalls? Something within the framework to adjust harvest and still remain a liberal season.
Well, I don't want to get out. I don't want to get out of my lane, so to speak, as we say these days. What I will say, because those kind of decisions are the purview of the state biologist and the federal biologists that have that responsibility to help manage those harvests and those regulations. What I can do, though, is report on what they have done in one particular situation that I think mirrors what you're talking about, and that is in the Atlantic flyway. We have 3 stocks of mallards in North America: Western mallards, mid-continent mallards. Okay, so Western mallards are Pacific flyway, Alaska. There's some of those breed in interior British Columbia, the Washington, Oregon, California. That's kind of our Western mallard stock. Mid-continent mallards are going to be the mid-continent U.S., Canadian prairies, Western boreal forest, and then you have Eastern mallards, which is Eastern Canada and Northeastern U.S. Regulatory packages for the Pacific flyway are set. These overarching season length and bag limit regulations are set in the Pacific flyway based on the status of Western mallards. In the Central and Mississippi flyway, those overarching frameworks are set based on the status of mid-continent mallards and their pond conditions. It used to be that those overarching frameworks for the Atlantic flyway were set based on population status of Eastern mallards. But what happened was exactly what you described there, Jim. For Eastern mallards, they were undergoing a long-term decline, while some of the other duck species in that geography, in that flyway, were maintaining population levels or even increasing. And so what you saw several years ago was the realization of exactly what you described, where they said, hey, if we continue to base our overarching regulatory frameworks on the status of mallards, we're going to be losing out on some harvest opportunities for these other birds, these other species that are doing pretty well and that make up a really significant portion of our harvest in this flyway. So they did exactly what it is that you're asking about. They went away from setting regulatory frameworks in the Atlantic flyway they went away from using Eastern mallards as the basis for those regulatory frameworks and instead adopted a multi-stock harvest management approach where now they're based on the combined population status of green-winged teal, wood ducks, ringneck ducks, and golden eyes. And so there is precedent for doing exactly what you're talking about. Whether that would ever be the case in the Central flyway or for mid-continent mallards or Western mallards, I don't see that threat occurring, that quote threat, that situation occurring anytime soon, given the status of mallard populations. Now you could ask about, well, is there a situation where there are some other species that we would need to carve out of that overarching framework, like a sticky and six, right? So and so the answer there is yes. There certainly is precedent for that. Pintails, scaup, redheads, canvasbacks, black ducks, mottled ducks. Those all have species-specific regulations.
Good stuff. I'm going to let somebody else circle back.
Yeah, I want to circle back to Lincoln Peterson estimates just for a minute. If I'm not
veto,
mistaken,
can I veto?
No, this won't be nearly as in-depth as Jimbo's question.
All right.
So they predate AHM a little bit, don't they?
Oh, most definitely.
Right in that?
Most definitely. Frederick Lincoln. I don't know the exact date of the publication. A lot of the folks that deal with that banding data would be able to cite that to you by heart, but it's way before AHM.
But so there's been an opinion, some people really want to rely on that versus AHM. They kind of pick and choose their data, but those numbers don't really differ that much in the overall estimate of population, do they? I mean, they kind of parallel each other.
I think your statement about them paralleling one another is fairly accurate. It's been a while since I've looked at at those comparisons. But so here's the thing. It would be inappropriate to say, hey, let's substitute Lincoln Peterson estimates of mallard population size directly into the AHM models. And I'm kind of getting out, I'm risking getting out over my skis here because I'm starting to talk about harvest regulations and the AHM model, but this one seems pretty simple to me. It would be inappropriate to take Lincoln Peterson population estimates and plug them into adaptive harvest management protocols, because adaptive harvest management is it's a decision process. It's a structured process by which regulatory decisions are made. Embedded within that are a series of population models that try to forecast the effects of habitat and harvest on population size. And then based on current conditions and our knowledge of population dynamics and the effects of harvest on those population dynamics, it says for a given year, what is the optimal regulatory strategy that we should choose in order to maximize harvest over the long term, maximize harvest without imperiling, maximize harvest over the long term inherently requires consideration for the sustainability of the population at a level that allows you to continue to maximize harvest. So kind of accidentally slipped off onto a tangent there, but the point is that adaptive harvest management is a decision process. Now, you could say, well, let's look at the population models within AHM and make a determination as to whether the Lincoln Peterson estimates, whether we should be using those in the population model versus the BPOP based models. But you would have to redo the entire those entire models of population dynamics, or you'd have to kind of redo the optimization process. And it shouldn't really change anything. I don't think. It would just be it would be as if you kind of started over with a different source of data. I wouldn't expect it to necessarily generate different regulatory options, unless one is fundamentally superior to the other, and in terms of how it's describing population dynamics. And I don't know that it is, but I'll stop there. But so it's not as simple. I'll say it's not as simple as just taking one number and plugging it in and using it instead. That would be an inappropriate thing to do.
Right. So just to clarify, that was not kind of my point of the question. It certainly wasn't what I was suggesting. It was more for the people that question AHM, where are the ducks? I don't see them. They don't exist. All these naysayers and conspiracy theorists. But if you use an entirely different model, like the Lincoln Peterson estimates, the numbers really don't differ that much. So that was more kind of to dispel that myth, I guess, a little bit. So my last deal with Lincoln Peterson, so we can move on away from it. You talk about harvest recovery on banding data, and it's in talking with some other guys at the U and other places, it seems pretty apparent that we are not banding anywhere near the number of birds that we did 30 plus 40 years ago. You've got some banding location sites due to COVID that have been entirely shut down. So this could be a little bit more of an Ed Penny question, but how do we get involved as hunters, as the common person, to try to motivate our legislators to spend a little money on waterfowl research and banding?
This is going to feel like a dodge, but it's really not. Because
throw it off on Ed. Throw it off on Penny.
No, I mean, I have to defer to my state and federal colleagues that are closer to those banding operation decisions. We used to, I've been actually reading some old documents, and Ducks Unlimited used to do a lot in terms of some operational banding programs back in the early days, maybe 30s, 40s type thing. We haven't been involved in those banding programs in a very serious, from very serious perspective for a long time, as far as I'm aware. Some of that relates to, there aren't many people on our staff that have banding permits, master banding permits. That's not to say that we couldn't get them if we wanted to, but the banding programs have been run through the states and through the federal agencies for quite some time, and they do periodic assessments of banding needs for different species, and a lot of that is tied to which of these species do they need data on to ensure we're making reliable harvest regulatory decisions. I'm not certain, and this is totally honest because I'm not engaged in a lot of the conversations around banding needs and banding quotas, and what are the limitations to getting people to participate and actually, because we kind of have to go, let's don't let COVID kind of cloud this. The issue of declining banding on preseason banding on the prairies was occurring before COVID, and I honestly don't know what's driving that decline. I don't know if it's just some of the traditional sites are not as productive as they used to be. I don't know if it's a staffing issue. I just don't know. That's and I don't know if the biggest solution, the biggest need is one of would be policy in nature. I just don't know. That's a question for Ed and for Luke Naylor there in Arkansas. He's involved in those discussions way more than I am. So I always like to pass things off to Luke anytime I can.
I don't blame you.
But that's an honest answer. I'm just not involved in those conversations enough to give you the answer.
Gotcha.
Hey, Jim, can I lean on you a little bit as the senior member of the panel, I guess? For our
Wait a minute. Clay's older than I am.
Yeah, but Clay doesn't know anything. I mean, just saying. Now, back to the discussion. So, like, back he threw out a set of dates, kind of 1985 to maybe 1992.
Mm-hmm.
In the late 80s, I was a teenager back then and hardcore duck hunter at the time. And it's funny, it appears that 30 years later, we're going through another cycle of what happened. And although I didn't realize it at my age, what was going on, do you remember exactly? I know in Louisiana, we had 3 ducks in 30 days.
Mm-hmm.
And then, we slowly came out of it, and then we had some bang up seasons. So that 85 to 95 or 92, I don't remember what the exact dates are, but do you remember those days of when was Arkansas really in a slump and then come back out of it? Tell us a little bit about your experiences at that time.
Yeah, I kind of remember it pretty well, actually. I can remember running around, just out of high school, chasing ducks pretty hard all over Arkansas and Missouri quite a bit because of the 30-day seasons. You travel a lot. But one of the things, 2 things, and I'm going to carry on here. One thing I do remember, I was hunting a place at that time west of Truman Lake, kind of towards the Kansas side. It's a big WMA now near Rich Hill, Missouri, called Four Rivers WMA. And we were there. We didn't know nothing. Heck, we was from out of town. We was talking to an old timer, and there was a pile of ducks flying around. And he said, "Son, there's as many ducks now as there ever was. They just don't want us to kill them." And that was, right, the 30-day seasons just gotten started. To the same time frame, Mike was involved in a conversation with us earlier in the year about some folks saying, "Man, there ain't ducks like they used to. They just want us to kill them all." So been a mindset difference there. But to your point, I remember them 30-day seasons. I remember kind of as it went from point system to 3 and 30, which really wasn't a bad deal. And then I remember in the early 90s guiding 30-day duck season, but we were busy. Had a lot of folks, duck calls, people wanted to buy duck calls, things were going well. Then I was working for another outfit. We started Richington Guide Service in 1994. And that was the year we went from a 30-day duck season and 3 ducks to a 40-day duck season and 3 ducks. So that was on the advent when the prairies were busting loose. Man, duck populations were growing very quickly. In 95, we went to kind of the pre-days of AHM 50 and 5. In 96, we went to full AHM, liberal, moderate, restricted. And I remember them very well. And it seemed like it took forever to come out of that slump. and using Mike's earlier numbers, I thought it was very interesting. There's a lot of people hollering the sky is falling because of this huge drought, but we went into at least the numbers we know of. 92 mid-continental mallards were 9.2 million versus the mid-80s 5 million. That's a sizable difference, and you know, there's a lot of us speculating on what might be coming down the road next year, and I still wonder, you know, if we don't get some precipitation this winter and into next spring, there may need a change to come. But that being said, I just think we're going to have a bunch of mean, old, hard to call ducks this year, and it'll make it interesting, you know. But those were fun times, and hopefully the next 20 years will be as fruitful as the last 20 some, or even going back in the 80s, because they're, you know, look at the duck hunting business, how it's grown. Granted, there were people building decoys and calls and duck boats in the 70s and 80s, but now look how many more people are involved in that, and the economic impact it's had on organizations like Ducks Unlimited, like Delta Waterfowl, like RNT calls. You know, Jason, how many guide businesses are there still? You know, not as many as there were, but I can remember in early 2000s, if you had a pickup and a four-wheeler using the duck guide business, you know, whether you were good at it or not, or had good places to hunt, people were getting involved in that waterfowl boom. And it's been an interesting time. And I just hope we can continue to make the right moves and keep the interest up. If there is a reset, if we do go to restrictive next year, I don't think it'll kill the industry nor kill the sport. Which is another AHM question. This could be a whole nother conversation, but the windows for liberal, moderate, restrictive are pretty black and white based on mallard populations and ponds. So we'll save that one for another one, because I see we're getting close to an hour here.
Yeah,
well, it's interesting that you say that as far as the sport going forward. As the younger person on this panel, you know, sitting right here in this room, I remember the point system. I remember going to 3 and 30. You know, I remember all those. I remember hunting and seeing what the skies looked like when it was, you know, bad numbers. And it's interesting. We've seen booming days since then. But usually when Clay and I talk about the good old days, a lot of the good old days were 3 and 30. And it's just a perception of what good was. I mean, yeah, we've killed a lot of ducks since then, but the sport was healthy even back then.
Very much. I got a point. I see everybody's wheels turning. I want to jump on this one. I can remember too, a lot of time in the days in the 80s and 90s of the 3 and 30, kind of how we got to hunt in big groups in the woods, because, you know, there's no problem to go shoot, you know, 4 guys shoot 12 mallards. So you take 8 guys, you shoot 24. But I think also too, then if you look at this past year and the report that Mike put together after duck season, weather patterns were different. Even though overall bee pops were not as good, we were picking up a lot of ducks. We had good weather patterns. We had good water conditions. And migrations were more dependable. Our duck energy days were higher, I think, then. Rice was different. Now I think we're seeing a big wide distribution of wintering mallards, whereas in time frame of the 80s, I think we saw still the more condensed wintering area is a little bit more defined than we do now. I think that's probably a lot of what we thought we were seeing in the 80s versus what we were seeing recently with higher mid-continental mallards.
Yeah, that's a good point. Even though I feel like we're sitting there trying to figure out where on this cycle we are right now. Are we still, you know, nosing down? You know, what's going to happen? But the landscape, like you mentioned with rice and concentration of mid-continental mallards, the landscape is so different now than it was in the 80s too, that even though the cycle may be similar, it's entirely different too.
You bet. That's something I carry on. You know, everybody talks about, people are happier if they just shoot a limit, whatever the limit is, if it's 10, 3 or 6 or whatever. If most people say, man, I shot my limit today, they're happy. That being said, when you back up the clock, something I remember Larry Reynolds saying when we did the first State of Waterfowl at Grove Savant, he pointed it out, and Doug and Casey and I and Mike all really know this. I just never really put it in that true perspective. A rice field now is way different than that rice field was 30 years ago. and then you look at the loss of natural wetlands and BLH, and it's just, I start pairing it up and I say, okay, here's a problem, here's a problem, here's a problem. I don't know how you ever get it circled back around. But evolution's ongoing, right? It's going to continue to happen. It's going to continue to change. We just got to change with it.
Yeah, I know. Everywhere I go, everybody wants to talk ducks, and they all tell me what's happening and what's wrong with the world. And my answer to almost every one of them is yes, 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 and yes.
You're right.
They all think it's one single event, but it's that plus everything else.
Tons of things.
Yeah, it's almost too much to even talk about. Guys, we're getting very close to our time limit. Mike, I want to thank you for coming here today and visiting with us. Is there anything that you would like to wrap up from your standpoint as a waterfowl scientist to before we close this thing? I'll give you the floor for a second.
I appreciate that, Doug. The one thing that I'll just close on is just trying again to put this drought in context, and I agree with everything that you guys said. It's fascinating we have a generation of hunters that are going to be going through their first drought ever. Maybe in the next couple of years, depending on what happens with projected population sizes and all that kind of stuff, because we don't have the surveys, maybe facing some restrictive moderate seasons. That would be the first time that any of that generation of hunters has gone through it. And it's different. But I think what we would try to convey, and will try to convey, is that this is normal. This is normal, folks. This is normal. Everybody, every waterfowl biologist that's in the business, has ever been in the business, will tell you that you cannot have wetland conditions, habitat conditions, breeding habitat conditions that are always good. You cannot always have breeding population sizes that are at record highs. It's not the way any natural system works. And we've tried to kind of communicate that periodically about, hey, y'all, someday we're going to have a drought. Don't panic. It's going to be okay. As long as we can maintain the habitat base such that once those favorable environmental conditions return, we're going to be fine. The folks that come behind us are going to be fine. The duck populations are going to be fine. This is not a time to be jumping ship on duck hunting. It's not a time to be panicking. It's a time to stay the course. It's a time to recognize that what we're seeing is a natural part of the system. Now, there's a lot of other things that we talked about here in terms of landscape change and how it's influencing duck distributions during the non-breeding period, and that's certainly a topic that we need to discuss at some point. But from a breeding standpoint, breeding habitat standpoint, and population size standpoint, this is normal. This is to be expected. And, if you're a duck hunter, it's almost like a rite of passage. You have to go through a time of depressed population conditions and dry prairie wetland conditions to really say you're a duck hunter. And so just kind of keep that in mind. And this may be one of those times for us.
Well, good deal, guys. It's been a great conversation. And as usual, we always run out of time before we talk about everything we want to discuss. And Mike, hopefully we can get you guys back on here another day and continue some of the conversation. Thank you again for taking time out of your schedule. And Jim, Casey, I know you guys are busy, so hopefully we can get together here shortly and continue to talk about the state of waterfowl. And we can't conclude today without thanking the guys at Express Boats. And we pick on Clay, but he's been great and instrumental in putting all this together. And we thank him and Rory over there at Express for giving us the opportunity to have a forum to talk about ducks and talk about the things we love to do in the outdoors. So calm down before waterfowl season starts. We'd hate to have another season of duck hunting impacted by COVID. So be praying for everybody out there. Stay safe and continue to tell your friends about the State of Waterfowl series and spread it around. And we'd love for you guys to tune in and to listen to what all we have to talk about. So see you guys on the next episode.
Thank you, Doug.
Thanks, Doug.
Thanks so much for joining us today. Be sure to invite your friends to listen, share, and subscribe to this podcast. We all want to know what is the state of waterfowl.